Hello and welcome to Positively United. Today, Sunday, the 1st of February 2026. Looking forward to the game against Fulham that kicks off later. But this video is about the protests that are going to happen outside the ground at 1 o'clock this afternoon. Now, there's been some comment online about if you don't comment about the protest, you must be a Glazerite. This is becoming very, very tiresome, this phrase Glazerite, and it's being thrown around by one particular YouTuber. How, by the way, a respectable and respected journalist like Andy Mitten, for example, who's got virtually a lifetime history of writing about United, can end up being called a Glazerite by a certain, YouTube channel, is a disgrace. But unfortunately, that's how polarized what actually a united front against the Glazers has become. And it's become childish. And what I'd like to do in this video is to put what I think is a more, dare I say, grown-up way of looking at this. Let's start off with some fundamental statements at the beginning. I detest the Glazer ownership of Manchester United, and I've detested it since before it happened. Way back in 2005 when this thing was first starting to happen, it would have been May 25, wouldn't it? I hated the idea of the Glazers owning it. I've got to be honest with you, and maybe this doesn't reflect well on me, but I was really nervous about an American ownership of the club because I was actually living in America at the time. Would you believe? I lived there for about 4 years. And I found it incredible or unlikely that American owners would fully understand the game of football outside of America. And I really wondered why they were getting involved in United even before the takeover happened. And all my worst fears, but not held just by me, held by millions of others, our worst fears were realised. It was obvious the Glazers weren't getting involved in Manchester United because they loved Manchester United or football. They were in it for the money, and they always have been. And that's why their ownership was a leveraged ownership. They borrowed to buy the club, and then they transferred the liability for that borrowing over to the club. So-called leveraged buyout. And that has saddled United with that enormous debt right the way from 2005. In fact, the debt's bigger now because of refinancing and restructuring than it was when they first took the debt out. Now, I want to make one thing absolutely clear at the outset. There is fundamentally nothing wrong with borrowing to buy an asset. It's a common business practice. And in fact, if anything, it's more common in America than it is in Britain and the rest of Europe. Leverage buyouts are a very American thing. And they're not all bad. I just want to put this seed in your mind. If we want somebody to buy United from the Glazers, they're going to have to spend, what, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 more billion? Do you seriously believe that anybody is going to have that sort of money lying in their pocket in cash, ready to spend? Not even the richest sheikh in the Middle East has that sort of money just dangling around. Any purchase of Manchester United that gets the Glazers out will almost certainly have some kind of leveraging behind it. What matters is the honesty of that. That's probably not the right word. A leverage buyout, which then results in that debt being paid down over time, is no bad thing, particularly if it brings success and growth in the business. But we all know about the Glazers. They don't care about football. They don't care about Manchester United. My guess is they know very little about the game. We see them, don't we, when they come and watch a Manchester United game being played. They look utterly vacant. They look like a bored royal watching the FA Cup final. And by the way, that's not Prince William. He likes his football. But, if you're British and you've watched FA Cups in the past, you know that in the 1970s or 80s, they'd wheel some minor royal out to watch the FA Cup final. They'd look bored stiff. That's how the Glazers look. They know nothing about the game. They don't care about Manchester United. We all know that. So yes, I want to see the Glazers out. I also believe fundamentally in the right to protest. It's a very British thing, and I'm very proud of it. So the protests that are being organised by the 58 today have got my full support in that respect. But nothing is ever quite that simple. And YouTubers and other social media influencers who try to make it out as such, some sort of childish binary, you're a Glazerite or you're not argument, are treating you like children. And you're not. I want to read out, and I'm going to take a bit of time to do this. I want to read out what the 58 said when announcing this protest. I quote, "After lurching from one disaster to another, Ratcliffe comes across as an incompetent clown turning the club into a circus." Now that was in relation, this is my understanding, to the sacking of Amorim which had just occurred. They also went on to criticise Omar Barada and Jason Wilcox, and describing the sacking of Amorim as it's been an extraordinary and deeply troubling few days at Manchester United. On the pitch, we're watching mediocre performances from an average team drifting without identity, direction or ambition. Off it, the chaos is even worse. I disagree with virtually all of that. The problem is the Glazers. It's not Ineos. I genuinely believe that. I probably have to accept it's not a majority point of view, but it's definitely my point of view, and I actually think it stands up to logic. To describe Ratcliffe as coming across as an incompetent clown turning the club into a circus, I'm sorry, that's Mark Goldbridge language. It really is. That doesn't help anybody. Our problem is the Glazers. In my opinion, it's not Ineos. Have Ineos made mistakes? Sure they have. They shouldn't have kept Ten Hag after the FA Cup win in 2024. They should have stuck by their guns. We all know that they would have sacked Ten Hag the day after the FA Cup final had he lost it. But he won it. And he put them into a really tough dilemma, which they chickened out of, in my opinion. So yes, criticise the Ineos for that mistake. They compounded that mistake by appointing Ruben Amorim, a man manifestly not suited to managing a Premier League team. Genuinely, yeah, that's the case. Why do I say that? Well, look at the evidence. Look at the track record. He clearly wasn't. But you know what? Before he even managed a single game for United, another club had wised up and had worked out Amorim, and that's Liverpool. Now, we might not think that's a great thing to look at Liverpool for lessons, but they looked at Ruben Amorim when they were looking for a new manager, and they decided that he wasn't the right man to manage a Premier League team. They worked him out. Why didn't we? Why didn't Ineos? So I criticise them for that too. And there's probably a third criticism coming down the line. I would have sacked Ruben Amorim at the end of last season after that horrendous performance against Tottenham in the Europa League final and the worst track record in a season ever. I know it was only half a season, but it was abysmal. So yeah, they've got it wrong 3 times. What have they got right? Well, they funded an almost complete rebuild of Carrington. Yeah, that's important. Manchester United players and United squad deserves some of the best facilities in the Premiership, if not the world. And they've tried to rectify that, and I think they've done a really good job. They've put in place a football management structure that we were crying out for. A head coach with a team around him making decisions for the club, not just for an individual manager. So we no longer had to endure the disaster of purchases like Anthony because a manager desperately wanted a particular player. No, now we buy players because they fit a particular vision of our future. And who can deny that the recruitment has not improved over the last 2 years? Are you seriously suggesting that players like Cunha and Mbuemo and Le Mans are not better than what we were buying before? And the outgoings are just as important. Waving bye-bye to players who clearly had lost it at United, were not good enough to play for United. I think Ineos have done exceptionally well on the recruitment part of it. And by the way, the criticisms that are going around today about United perhaps not buying anybody in the January transfer window, I would point out to the fact that several people who are today criticising Manchester United for not buying anybody were criticising the names that were being mentioned earlier this week and last week, like Ndidi, for example, or Loftus-Cheek, criticised virtually every single name that was mentioned. But now you want United to take one of those players, buy them on loan or buy them outright? Look, lads, which way is it? Do you want the players or don't you want the players? A lot of the criticism is really unfair of Ineos. And I wonder why the 58 mentioned them in that way in their statement, because it sounds like the 58 are just against ownership rather than a particular ownership. Look, fan ownership is not going to happen. I'd love to see it happen, sort of, although I must admit I've looked at Barcelona over the last few years and wondered whether fan ownership is quite as good as I imagined it to be. But I'll give you one example, and it's a completely different level of football. But Wrexham was owned by fans for very, very many years. It was the only way that that club survived. It would have gone completely bankrupt and it would have ceased to exist if fans hadn't come in and bailed it out and ran it for a number of years. But how's Wrexham become successful? Hollywood ownership. If you say that you're protesting against the Glazers, but you then also rope Ineos in, who I believe have done more right than wrong, I think it just weakens your argument. And particularly, as we're fooling ourselves if we think that there was anything else but Ineos available at the time Ineos bought their 28% minority stake. Because we always get the spectre, don't we, of the Qatari ownership or potential ownership being brought up. Because remember at the time when the Glazers set up about this process of finding potential bidders, potential buyers for the club, we didn't just have Ineos, we had Qatar, or not Qatar, depending on who you believe. So the bid itself, sort of bid, because of course no money was ever laid down, no proof of the money to purchase the club was ever laid down in front of the process. The bidder was Sheikh Jazim bin Hamad Al Thani. I thought I'd read out his full name rather than just Sheikh Jazim, because I think it's important we know who was involved in wanting to buy the club. It wasn't friendly, cuddly Sheikh Jazim. It was Sheikh Jazim bin Hamad Al Thani, a Qatari banker. Now, this is all very, very murky, and it's very hard to prove, and it's very hard to disprove. But does anybody in their right mind believe that a Qatari banker was going to buy Manchester United? We all kind of suspect, don't we, that it's really the Qatari state who are behind the bid, and for whatever reason, they chickened out, or perhaps never had any real intent. Who knows? It's all speculation. But the idea that the Qataris would have been a suitable owner of Manchester United is, in my opinion, deeply repugnant. You know, Qatar is an undemocratic authoritarian monarchy. It's got significant human rights concerns. It limits free expression. There would be no protests, by the way, in Qatar, as we've got today. There are repressions against political dissent, widespread discrimination against women and gay people. Migrant workers face serious abuses, including wage theft and poor access to redress. And that's before we get to the links with terrorism. Qatar's long been accused of enabling or tolerating support networks for Islamicist groups, including Hamas and the Taliban. Do you know what? If you think INEOS are bad, well, at least they're not enablers of terrorism and human rights abusers. So can we just stop knee-jerk kicking INEOS and give them some credit for the stuff they do well? What we should be asking ourselves is, how do we get rid of the Glazers? That's the most important thing. Speaking about getting rid of INEOS as well, and that terrible phrase Glinios just muddies the water. We need to get rid of the Glazers. INEOS might actually be a help in that process. Seriously. And why attack anybody who might be a help? INEOS could buy the shares they don't own. The, what is it, 68% that... yeah. So the Glazers own 67... well, actually, 68% of the total voting rights through shares. And Glinios own very nearly 29%. The simplest and most straightforward way to get rid of the Glazers would be INEOS buying out the Glazers. So why don't we get behind INEOS buying out the Glazers? It's just a question. If your main motive in all this is to get rid of the Glazers, why not support INEOS to get rid of the Glazers? I'll just leave that one hanging in the air. INEOS might also be a helpful factor if we find somebody, and I'll come to what I mean by we find somebody. If we find somebody to buy the Glazers out, there's absolutely no guarantee that they will know anything more about football than the Glazers. Do we want that? I don't think we do. Wouldn't it be great to have somebody owning the club actually know something about football? No, I don't get all this stuff about how Sir Jim knows nothing about football. And I absolutely don't get this stuff about how he's not really a Man United fan. The guy was born in Manchester, for God's sake. Was Sheikh Jazim born in Manchester? I think it's absolutely undeniable that Jim Ratcliffe knows about football. And whilst he might have ended up being a Chelsea fan when he was living in London, I've absolutely no doubt at all that when he grew up, he was a Manchester United fan. There's absolutely no reason to disbelieve him on that. If you believe, by the way, that people on YouTube with made-up names are Man United fans, why do you disbelieve Sir Jim, born in Manchester, is a United fan? So INEOS could very well be a part of the process. If we got somebody to buy the Glazers out, but they knew nothing about football, it might be very handy to keep INEOS on board, managing, as they currently do, the football part of the business. But let's come back to the question: how do we get rid of it? How do we get rid of the Glazers? Because I never ever hear people talk about this, with very few exceptions. I think Stephen Howson has done a good video recently on how do we get rid of the Glazers. Because we need to work out what the strategy is to get rid of the Glazers. Because no number of protests, believe me, will get rid of the Glazers. Did the Glazers leave after the protests, in 2001, got the Liverpool game postponed? Did the Glazers leave the club then? No. No number of protests are going to get rid of the Glazers. I genuinely mean that. What will get rid of the Glazers is money. We need to find somebody who can go to the Glazers with an offer they can't turn down. And that didn't happen in the last process for whatever reason. So what I would like us to do is to, instead of constantly wishing the Glazers to go, is to try and make that happen. And that might be a very, very long-term project. So I'm going to front this up as an idea. And I'm sure the 58 must have done it because it's so obvious. I don't think there's a football club in the world that doesn't have a better connected person with the world of true wealth than Manchester United in David Beckham. 2 weeks ago, David Beckham was at Davos, where he was rubbing shoulders with literally the most powerful and richest people in the world, both from the world of government and commerce. He is a uniquely connected individual. Has anybody ever given any thought or any actual work to the idea that David Beckham could be in some way a person who puts together a group of interested people who could buy out the Glazers? Either buy out the Glazers or buy out Glazers and Ineos, or perhaps more sensibly, use Ineos as part of the lever that gets the Glazers out. That to me is a more grown-up way of looking at this. Yes, we want the Glazers out, and you've got every right to protest. But could we just for once try to put together a pathway that will actually get rid of the Glazers rather than make a lot of noise about it? And finally, just because somebody doesn't agree with a protest or thinks that Ineos are doing a reasonably good job doesn't give you any right to call them a Glazerite. That's insulting. Stop it. Okay, that's all I have to say on this one. Bit of a rant. Understand. Not everyone's cup of tea. Totally appreciate that. Not every video I do is like this. But if you like the video, please like it. If you like what I do on this channel, please click on subscribe. If you think that other people who you know would like what I do on this channel, let them know about it. Get them to subscribe too. Follow me on X. I try to post on X every day. Perhaps not every day, but I try my best. And you will know about new videos on X at the same time as I put them up on here on YouTube. If you want to do a financial contribution to the channel, I get no sponsorship from anybody. I get absolutely no funds at all. I'm trying to raise funds to do some better technical stuff on the videos. I'd gratefully receive, and the smallest of donation would be wonderful. I've set up a Ko-fi account for that. The link is in the description. Let's hope Man United beat Fulham today, and let's hope they do it in style. It'd be so lovely to see, wouldn't it? I'll see you later today after the game. I'll do my player ratings. But until then, see you next time and remain positively united.